Sarah Martinez adjusted her whistle around her neck as she unlocked the gates to Maplewood Elementary's playground. At 28, she had been the school's PE teacher for 3 years, and mornings like this reminded her why she loved her job. The autumn air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and golden sunlight filtered through the oak trees that bordered the playground, casting dancing shadows across the empty swings and monkey bars. Students wouldn't arrive for another hour, but Sarah always came early to set up equipment and enjoy the peaceful moments before the joyful chaos began. She wheeled out the cart of playground balls, jump ropes, and cones, arranging them in neat rows near the basketball court. The school sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by woods on 3 sides, creating a natural barrier that made the playground feel like a safe haven from the outside world. As she worked, Sarah noticed Mrs. Chen, the elderly crossing guard, hadn't arrived yet. Mrs. Chen was always punctual, arriving at 7 sharp every morning to prepare for the school day. Sarah glanced at her watch, 7:15 a.m. Strange, but perhaps the 70-year-old woman was simply running late. The first sign something was wrong came from the woods. A low, guttural moan echoed through the trees, followed by the sound of branches snapping. Sarah paused, basketball in hand, listening intently. Wildlife wasn't uncommon in the area. Deer, raccoons, even the occasional bear had been spotted, but this sound was different. It was almost human, yet wrong somehow, carrying a quality that made her skin crawl. She set down the basketball and walked toward the edge of the playground where the chain-link fence separated the school grounds from the forest. The moaning grew louder, joined by what sounded like shuffling footsteps. Through the gaps in the trees, Sarah caught glimpses of movement, figures stumbling between the trunks, their gait unnatural and jerky. "Hello," she called out, though her voice came out smaller than intended. "Is someone hurt out there?" The movement stopped. For a moment, the woods fell silent except for the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then, as if responding to her voice, the moaning resumed with renewed intensity. More figures emerged from deeper in the forest, all moving in the same shambling manner toward the fence. Sarah's heart began to race as the first figure stepped into a patch of sunlight. It was a man in a torn business suit, his white shirt stained with something dark and wet. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes, those weren't the eyes of a living person. They were clouded, unfocused, yet somehow fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach turn. Behind him came others. A woman in a jogging outfit, her leg bent at an impossible angle yet still functional. A teenager in a fast food uniform, his name tag reading Tyler, barely visible through the grime covering his chest. They all shared the same characteristics: the gray skin, the clouded eyes, the unnatural movements. Sarah stumbled backward, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. These people looked sick, but it was more than that. They looked dead. Yet they were moving, approaching the fence with single-minded determination. The first man reached the chain-link barrier and pressed against it, his fingers curling through the metal links. The fence held, but more figures were emerging from the woods, at least a dozen now, all converging on the playground's perimeter. The metal began to rattle and strain under their collective weight. Sarah's teacher instincts kicked in. She needed to get to the school, warn the principal, call for help. But as she turned toward the building, she froze. Through the parking lot, she could see the main road, and there were more of them, dozens of these shambling figures moving along the street, some heading toward the school. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her friend Lisa, who worked at the hospital across town. "Something's happening. People are getting sick, attacking others. Stay safe." Sarah's hands shook as she typed back. "At school. They're here too. What's going on?" No response came. The moaning grew louder, more urgent, as if the creature sensed her fear. The fence continued to rattle, and Sarah noticed with growing horror that some of the figures were beginning to climb, their decomposing fingers finding purchase in the chain links. She ran toward the school building, her mind racing. The students would be arriving soon, along with the other teachers and staff. She had to warn them, had to find a way to keep everyone safe. But as she reached for the door handle, she realized with sinking dread that this peaceful morning had transformed into something that would change everything forever. The playground that had been filled with laughter and joy just yesterday was about to become a battleground between the living and the dead. Sarah's sneakers squeaked against the polished linoleum as she sprinted down the empty hallway toward the main office. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and the sound of her own breathing seemed deafeningly loud in the silence. Behind her, the rattling of the chain-link fence grew more violent, punctuated by inhuman groans that seemed to multiply with each passing second. "Mr. Johnson," she called out as she burst through the office doors. Principal Johnson looked up from his coffee and morning paperwork, his kind face creasing with concern at Sarah's panicked expression. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "There are people outside, sick people. They're trying to get through the fence. We need to call the police, the CDC, someone." Johnson stood immediately, his administrative instincts kicking in. At 55, he'd handled every crisis from food poisoning outbreaks to severe weather emergencies, but the fear in Sarah's eyes told him this was different. "Show me," he said, following her to the window that overlooked the parking lot. What they saw made Johnson's coffee mug slip from his fingers, shattering against the floor. The parking lot was no longer empty. Dozens of figures wandered aimlessly between the cars, their movements jerky and unnatural. Some wore torn clothing, others appeared to have fresh injuries, but all shared the same grayish complexion and vacant stare that Sarah had witnessed at the fence. "Dear God," Johnson whispered, reaching for his phone. He dialed 911, but the line was busy. He tried again, still busy. On his third attempt, he got through, but the dispatcher sounded frazzled and overwhelmed. 911, what's your emergency? This is Principal Johnson at Maplewood Elementary. We have multiple individuals on our property who appear to be seriously ill or something's very wrong with them. They're acting aggressively and... Sir, I'm going to need you to stay indoors and avoid contact with anyone showing symptoms of illness. We're experiencing a high volume of similar calls across the county." "Similar calls?" Johnson's voice cracked. "How many?" The line went dead. As if on cue, the first school bus rounded the corner onto the school's access road. Sarah watched in horror as the yellow vehicle approached the parking lot, completely unaware of the danger ahead. The driver, Mrs. Patterson, had been transporting kids to Maplewood for over a decade and knew her route by heart. "We have to warn her," Sarah said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was too late. The bus slowed as it entered the parking lot, and immediately the wandering figures began converging on it. Mrs. Patterson must have seen them because the bus lurched to a sudden stop, its brakes squealing. Through the windshield, they could see her frantically reaching for her radio. "The children," Johnson said, his face pale. 32 kids on that bus. More buses were visible in the distance, following their usual morning route. In 15 minutes, nearly 400 students would be arriving at what was supposed to be a safe haven of learning and growth. Sarah grabbed Johnson's arm. "We need to lock down the school. Emergency protocol, now." Johnson nodded, his training taking over despite the surreal circumstances. He activated the school's emergency lockdown system, and immediately red lights began flashing in every hallway while automated announcements echoed through the building. "This is an emergency lockdown. All staff and students report to designated safe areas immediately." The few early arriving teachers who had been setting up their classrooms emerged from their rooms, confusion evident on their faces. Ms. Rodriguez from second grade, Mr. Kim from the library, and Coach Williams from the gym all converged on the main office. "What's the situation?" Coach Williams asked, his military background evident in his calm demeanor. "Look outside," Sarah said grimly. As the small group gathered at the window, they watched Mrs. Patterson's bus suddenly accelerate, weaving between the infected figures as she desperately tried to reach the school's front entrance. Several of the creatures threw themselves at the moving vehicle, their bodies making sickening thuds against the yellow metal. The bus screeched to a halt directly in front of the school's main doors, and Mrs. Patterson leaned on the horn, 3 long blasts, their emergency signal for immediate evacuation assistance. "We have to help those kids," Ms. Rodriguez said, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. "And we will," Johnson replied, his voice steadying with resolve. "But we need a plan. Sarah, you know the playground layout better than anyone. Coach Williams, you've got emergency response training. Ms. Rodriguez, Mr. Kim, we'll need you to help coordinate once we get everyone inside safely." Through the office window, they could see more buses approaching in the distance, unaware they were driving into a nightmare. The infected in the parking lot had noticed the school building itself now, some pressing their faces against the ground floor windows, leaving smeared handprints on the glass. The morning that had begun with such promise was rapidly becoming a test of survival none of them had ever imagined. The rescue of the 32 children from Mrs. Patterson's bus had been a success, but it came at a cost. Coach Williams nursed a deep scratch on his forearm where one of the infected had grabbed him during the frantic evacuation, and the main entrance doors now bore the spiderweb cracks from multiple impacts as more of the creatures had thrown themselves against the reinforced glass. Principal Johnson surveyed their makeshift command center in the main office, where Mrs. Patterson sat wrapped in a blanket, still shaking from her harrowing drive through the infected-filled parking lot. The veteran bus driver had managed to radio the other approaching buses, diverting them to the high school 3 miles away, but not before confirming that the crisis extended throughout the entire district. "How many do we have?" Johnson asked Ms. Rodriguez, who had been coordinating the head count. 32 children, ages 6 to 11. 7 staff members including us. "Mrs. Patterson makes 8 adults total," she replied, consulting her hastily scribbled notes. Sarah pressed her face against the office window, watching the infected mill about the parking lot. There were more of them now, at least 50, and they seemed drawn to the school building itself. Some pressed against the windows, their clouded eyes staring blindly inward, while others wandered in aimless circles, occasionally bumping into cars or each other. "They're not very coordinated," she observed. "But look at how they react when that car alarm goes off." A red sedan security system had been triggered when one of the infected leaned too heavily against it, and immediately every creature in the parking lot turned toward the sound, shambling in that direction with renewed purpose. "Sound," Coach Williams said, wincing as he adjusted his bandaged arm. "They're attracted to sound." Mr. Kim, the librarian, had been quietly observing from his position near the door. "In my experience, when something attracts predators, it's usually because it helps them locate prey. We need to be very careful about noise levels." Johnson nodded grimly. "Which means we need to prepare for a long stay. The building is solid, but we need to secure all entry points and make sure we can maintain quiet conditions with 32 frightened children." The task seemed overwhelming, but Sarah's teacher instincts kicked in. "The children are scared, but they're also looking to us for guidance. If we stay calm and give them structure, they'll follow our lead." "What about supplies?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice still shaky. "Food, water, medicine?" "The cafeteria is stocked for the week," Ms. Rodriguez replied. "And there's a first aid station in the nurse's office. But we'll need to be strategic about rationing." Coach Williams stood up, his military bearing evident despite his injury. "First things first, we need to secure this building. Every entrance, every window on the ground floor. I suggest we start with the classroom doors facing the parking lot." They organized into teams, with Ms. Rodriguez staying with the children in the library, the most secure interior room, while the others began the grim task of fortification. Using desks, chairs, filing cabinets and anything else they could move, they began barricading the vulnerable access points. Sarah found herself working alongside Mr. Kim in the East Wing, stacking desks against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the first-grade classrooms. The librarian, despite his quiet demeanor, proved surprisingly strong and resourceful. "I never imagined I'd be doing this when I came to work this morning," he said, hefting a heavy desk into position. "None of us did," Sarah replied, glancing out the window at the infected figures wandering the playground. "But we're doing it for them," she added, nodding toward the library where they could hear Ms. Rodriguez's gentle voice reading a story to keep the children calm. As they worked, they discovered the infected's behavioral patterns. Movement near the windows drew their attention, but if they remained still and quiet, the creatures would eventually wander away. Sound was definitely a trigger. When Coach Williams accidentally knocked over a metal trash can in the gym, every infected figure visible through the windows immediately turned toward the building. "We need to establish quiet zones," Johnson decided during their brief planning meeting. "Whispered conversations only, no running in the hallways, and we'll need to keep the children occupied with silent activities." "What about the basement?" Mrs. Patterson suggested. "The boiler room, storage areas. If we needed to move deeper into the building." "Good thinking," Coach Williams agreed. "But let's hope it doesn't come to that." As afternoon approached, the reality of their situation settled in. The infected showed no signs of losing interest in the building, and several attempts to contact the outside world had failed. They were effectively trapped, responsible for the safety of 32 children, with no clear indication of when, or if, help would arrive. Sarah looked out at the playground equipment sitting empty in the afternoon sun, swings moving gently in the breeze. Just this morning she had been preparing for another normal day of teaching and laughter. Now she was preparing for something far more challenging, keeping everyone alive until the nightmare ended. By the third day, the reality of their situation had become undeniably clear. The small emergency snacks they'd rationed from the office vending machine were gone, and the children's water bottles were running dangerously low. The cafeteria, with its full kitchen and storage areas, lay tantalizingly close yet seemingly impossible to reach, separated from their safe zone by 2 hallways and the main lobby, all of which were visible to the infected pressed against the building's windows. Sarah crouched beside Principal Johnson in the administrative office, studying the school's floor plans spread across his desk. Red X marks indicated windows where infected figures had been spotted, while blue circles marked their current secure positions. "The service corridor," she whispered, tracing a thin line on the blueprint with her finger. "It runs behind the kitchen and connects to the basement storage. If we can get there without being seen." Coach Williams, his arm now properly bandaged thanks to supplies from the nurse's office, leaned over the map. "It's risky. One sound, one glimpse of movement through the wrong window, and we'll have them converging on our position." "We don't have a choice," Johnson replied quietly. "Ms. Rodriguez is doing her best to keep the children calm, but they're getting hungry, and scared hungry children are going to make noise." Mr. Kim had volunteered for the supply run despite his lack of physical training. "I know every inch of this building," he'd argued. "I've been here for 12 years and I've cataloged supplies in that storage room myself." The plan was simple but dangerous. Sarah and Mr. Kim would navigate the service corridor to reach the kitchen and storage areas, gathering as much food and water as they could carry. Coach Williams would maintain watch from the office, ready to create a distraction if needed, while Johnson stayed with Mrs. Patterson and Ms. Rodriguez to keep the children calm and quiet. At 2 p.m., when the infected seemed most sluggish, they'd noticed the creatures were less active during the heat of the day. Sarah and Mr. Kim began their mission. They moved like ghosts through the familiar hallways, their sock-covered feet silent on the polished floors. Every creak of the building, every whisper of the air conditioning system, seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. The service corridor was narrow and windowless, lined with pipes and electrical conduits. Sarah's flashlight beam, covered with her fingers to dim the glow, revealed their path ahead. They moved in single file, Mr. Kim's intimate knowledge of the building proving invaluable as he guided them around obstacles and potential noise hazards. "Stop," he whispered suddenly, holding up his hand. Sarah froze, straining her ears. Through the thin walls, she could hear shuffling footsteps and low moaning. They were directly parallel to the main hallway, where several infected had apparently wandered inside through an entrance they hadn't properly secured. They waited, hardly breathing, until the sounds faded. Then they continued, more cautiously than before. The storage room was a treasure trove of supplies, cases of water bottles, canned goods, crackers, and even some fresh fruit that hadn't spoiled. Mr. Kim efficiently loaded 2 large maintenance carts while Sarah kept watch at the door. "This should last us at least a week," he whispered, his arms full of supplies. Their return journey began smoothly, but halfway through the service corridor, disaster struck. Sarah's cart hit an unseen pipe junction, and several cans tumbled to the floor with metallic clangs that echoed through the narrow space like gunshots. The effect was immediate. From multiple directions came answering moans and the sound of shuffling feet. The infected had heard them and were converging on their general location. "Move, move," Sarah hissed, abandoning stealth for speed. They burst from the service corridor into the main hallway, pushing their carts as fast as they dared. Through the windows, Sarah could see infected figures pressed against the glass, their attention focused on the interior of the building. Some were already finding their way inside through breaches they hadn't discovered. Mr. Kim stumbled, his cart overturning and scattering supplies across the floor. Sarah helped him up, and together they grabbed what they could carry by hand, abandoning the carts and running for the office. Behind them, the first infected figure rounded the corner, a woman in a nurse's uniform, her name tag reading Helen. Sarah recognized her from the district health office, but Helen's kind eyes were now clouded and vacant, her mouth opening in a hungry moan. They burst through the office doors, Coach Williams immediately helping them barricade the entrance with filing cabinets. The supplies they'd managed to save were scattered across the floor, not as much as they'd hoped for but enough to buy them more time. "We found something else," Mr. Kim gasped, catching his breath. "Helen from the health office, she's one of them now. If the infection reached the district administration." The implication hung heavy in the air. If the infection had spread to the district level, help wasn't coming anytime soon. They were truly on their own, with limited supplies and an increasingly dangerous environment. Through the office windows, they watched more infected figures shambling through the hallways, drawn by the noise of their supply run. Their safe zone was shrinking and time was running out. The 4th night brought restless sleep and growing tensions. The infected had infiltrated more of the building, their constant moaning and shuffling footsteps creating an atmosphere of perpetual unease. In the cramped confines of the main office and adjoining conference room, 39 people tried to coexist while fear and uncertainty gnawed at everyone's nerves. Sarah woke to hushed but heated voices. Coach Williams and Mrs. Patterson were huddled near the window, their disagreement barely contained in whispered tones. "We can't just sit here waiting to die," Mrs. Patterson was saying, her bus driver's pragmatic nature evident. "I've driven these roads for 15 years. I know a back route through the woods that could get us to the highway." "With 32 children?" Coach Williams replied, his military training making him cautious. "In broad daylight with those things everywhere? It's suicide." "Staying here is suicide too," Mrs. Patterson shot back. "We're running out of food, water, and space. What happens when they break through our barricades?" Principal Johnson, who had been trying to catch a few hours of sleep, sat up wearily. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his tie long since abandoned, and the weight of leadership was etched in the lines around his eyes. "What's the situation?" he asked quietly. "Same argument we've been having for 2 days," Ms. Rodriguez interjected from her position near the children's sleeping area. "Some want to run, some want to stay. Meanwhile, the kids are getting more scared and restless." The children indeed were showing signs of strain. 8-year-old Tommy had been crying softly for his parents every night. Melissa, usually the brightest student in her 4th grade class, had barely spoken since the crisis began. The younger ones were asking increasingly difficult questions that the adults struggled to answer without causing more fear. Mr. Kim, ever the quiet observer, spoke up from his corner. "I've been monitoring the radio frequencies. There are scattered reports of safe zones in the major cities, but nothing about rescue operations in rural areas like ours." "Which proves my point," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again. "If help isn't coming to us, we need to go to help. And if we encounter a horde of those things on the road?" Sarah asked. "What then? We can't outrun them with children in tow." Coach Williams nodded grimly. "In my experience, movement without proper intelligence is how people get killed. We don't know what's out there." "We know what's in here," Mrs. Patterson countered. "And it's getting worse every hour." She wasn't wrong. During the night, they'd heard glass breaking somewhere in the building, and the sounds of more infected entering. Their safe zone had effectively shrunk to just the administrative wing, and even that felt increasingly precarious. Ms. Rodriguez stood up, her maternal instincts overriding the political dynamics. "While you're all debating strategy, I'm watching these children lose hope. They need to see us working together, not falling apart." Her words stung because they were true. The adults' disagreements were affecting the children's morale, and in their current situation, maintaining calm and hope was as important as physical security. "What if we compromise?" Sarah suggested, trying to find middle ground. "We continue fortifying our position, but we also scout potential escape routes. Knowledge gives us options." "I could check the basement access," Mr. Kim offered. "There's an old maintenance tunnel that connects to the district office building next door. If it's clear, it might give us an alternate route." Johnson rubbed his temples, feeling the pressure of making decisions that could determine everyone's fate. "The children's safety comes first. Whatever we decide, we need to be united in front of them." But unity was proving elusive. Mrs. Patterson's growing agitation was infectious, and several of the older children had begun asking when they were going home. The adults' whispered conversations and worried glances weren't lost on the kids, who were more perceptive than they were being given credit for. The breaking point came when 10-year-old Marcus, one of the 5th graders, approached Principal Johnson during the morning meal distribution. "Mr. Johnson," the boy said quietly, "are our parents okay?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Johnson looked around at the other adults, seeing his own fears reflected in their faces. None of them knew the answer, and the uncertainty was eating at everyone, adults and children alike. "We don't know yet, Marcus," Johnson answered honestly. "But we're doing everything we can to keep everyone safe until we can find out." The boy nodded solemnly and returned to his group, but Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes. The children were losing faith in the adults' ability to protect them, and that loss of confidence could be more dangerous than any external threat. As the 5th day began, the survivors faced a harsh reality. Their greatest enemy might not be the infected outside, but the fear and discord growing within their own ranks. Time was running out, and difficult decisions could no longer be postponed. The sound that woke them at 3:17 a.m. was different from the usual moaning and shuffling they'd grown accustomed to. This was the sharp crack of splintering wood, followed by the crash of something heavy hitting the floor. Sarah's eyes snapped open in the darkness, her heart immediately racing as she realized what the sound meant. Their barricades had been breached. "Everyone up, quietly," Coach Williams whispered urgently, his military training evident as he moved swiftly to assess the situation. Through the office window, they could see nothing in the darkened hallway, but the sounds were getting closer. Multiple sets of shuffling feet and the occasional thud of bodies bumping into walls. Principal Johnson gathered the children in the center of the room while Ms. Rodriguez and Mrs. Patterson helped keep them calm and quiet. The younger ones were crying softly, sensing the adults' fear even in the darkness. Sarah counted heads quickly. All 32 children were accounted for, but their safe space had just become a trap. Mr. Kim pressed his ear to the door, listening intently. "They're in the main hallway," he whispered. "At least 6 or 7 of them, maybe more. They seem to be moving toward the gym." "The gym has another exit," Coach Williams noted quietly. "If we can get there without being detected." But even as he spoke, they heard a new sound that made everyone freeze. The distinctive squeak of the office door handle being turned. Something was trying to get in. "The conference room," Johnson whispered, pointing to the adjoining space. "Move the children now." They formed a human chain, passing the youngest children from adult to adult as quietly as possible. Sarah found herself carrying 6-year-old Emma, who buried her face against Sarah's shoulder, trembling with fear. The little girl's trust in that moment strengthened Sarah's resolve. They had to protect these children no matter what. The office door handle rattled more insistently, and they could hear scratching sounds as fingernails clawed at the wood. Their barricade of filing cabinets was holding, but for how long? "There's another way," Mr. Kim whispered urgently. "The old book return chute from the library. It connects to the basement through a dumbwaiter system. It's small, but the children could fit." "And leave them alone down there?" Ms. Rodriguez shook her head. "Absolutely not." A new sound joined the scratching at the office door, glass breaking somewhere else in the building. More infected were finding their way inside, and their safe zone was rapidly becoming surrounded. Coach Williams made a command decision. "We split up. Kim, you take half the children through the chute to the basement. Rodriguez, go with them. The rest of us will create a distraction and meet you there." "I'm not leaving these kids," Sarah said firmly. "You're not leaving them, you're protecting them," Johnson replied. "If we all crowd into that chute, we'll make too much noise. This is our best chance." The plan was desperate but necessary. Mr. Kim led 15 children and Ms. Rodriguez toward the library access, while Sarah, Coach Williams, Johnson, and Mrs. Patterson prepared to guide the remaining 17 children through the darkened school to the basement stairs. The office door's barricade began to give way just as the first group disappeared into the old book chute. Scratching had turned to pounding, and they could see the filing cabinets beginning to shift. "Now," Coach Williams whispered. They slipped out through the conference room's rear exit, moving in single file through corridors that had become alien and threatening. Every shadow could hide danger, every corner could reveal infected figures blocking their path. 9-year-old David stumbled in the darkness, and Sarah caught him before he could fall. The boy looked up at her with frightened eyes that seemed far too mature for his age. "Miss Martinez," he whispered, "are we going to be okay?" Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "We're going to take care of each other," she promised, hoping her voice conveyed more confidence than she felt. They had made it halfway to the basement stairs when they encountered their first infected. The figure emerged from a classroom doorway. Mr. Henderson, the janitor who had always been kind to the children, always had a joke or a candy for them. Now his familiar face was gray and vacant, his maintenance uniform torn and stained. Coach Williams positioned himself between the children and the approaching figure, while Mrs. Patterson quietly guided the kids around the corner. But more infected were emerging from other classrooms, drawn by some instinct toward the group of living people moving through their territory. "The basement stairs are blocked," Johnson whispered urgently, pointing ahead where several infected figures wandered near their destination. They were trapped between two groups of infected, with 17 frightened children depending on them for protection. The school that had been their sanctuary was now a maze of dangers, and they had to find another way to safety before their luck ran out completely. In the distance, they could hear the faint sounds of the other group moving through the building's infrastructure, and Sarah prayed that Mr. Kim's knowledge of the building would be enough to keep the children safe. The gymnasium had never felt so vast and empty as it did in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah's group had managed to reach it through a circuitous route involving the music room, a supply closet, and a maintenance corridor that Coach Williams remembered from his years at the school. They'd lost precious time, but all 17 children were safe, huddled together in the center of the polished basketball court while the adults assessed their situation. "The main doors are blocked," Mrs. Patterson reported quietly, peering through the small window. "At least a dozen of them out there." Coach Williams checked the emergency exits. "Same here. And here." His voice carried a grim finality. "We're surrounded." Principal Johnson tried his phone one more time, but the battery had finally died. Their last connection to the outside world was gone, leaving them truly isolated in their makeshift fortress. What about Mr. Kim's group? Sarah asked, though they all knew there was no way to contact the other survivors in the basement. We have to assume they're safe, Johnson replied, though uncertainty clouded his voice. Right now we need to focus on these children. The infected outside seemed to sense their presence. The moaning grew louder, more insistent, and they could hear bodies pressing against the doors. The gymnasium's large windows, set high in the walls, showed moving shadows as more creatures gathered outside. 10-year-old Marcus, the boy who had asked about his parents, stood up from the group. What are we going to do, Mr. Johnson? The principal looked at the young face, seeing not just Marcus but all 32 children who had been entrusted to their care. Some were missing now, hopefully safe with Mr. Kim, but these 17 were here, looking to the adults for answers they weren't sure they had. We're going to do what we always do at Maplewood, Johnson said, his voice gaining strength. We're going to work together, we're going to be smart, and we're going to take care of each other. Sarah felt a surge of admiration for her principal. Even in their darkest moment, he was still teaching, still leading by example. Coach Williams was already moving, his tactical mind engaged. The gym equipment room, he said. Baseball bats, field hockey sticks, anything we can use to defend ourselves if they break through. The climbing rope, Sarah added, pointing to the thick rope hanging from the ceiling. We could get the children up to the storage loft if needed. As they began to prepare, something remarkable happened. The children, instead of panicking, began to help. Marcus and the other older students helped move the younger ones to the safest position. 12-year-old Ashley, the sixth grader who had been so quiet since the crisis began, suddenly spoke up. Miss Martinez, she said, remember the emergency drills we practiced? The ones where we had to be really quiet and follow directions exactly? Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. This is like those drills, isn't it? Except this time it's real and it's the most important one we'll ever do. The children straightened up, their familiar classroom discipline kicking in. They formed the neat lines they'd practiced hundreds of times, older students paired with younger ones, everyone knowing their role. Mrs. Patterson was working with Coach Williams to position equipment as defensive barriers. In all my years driving these routes, she said, I never imagined I'd be defending a school gymnasium at dawn. In all my years teaching, Johnson replied, hefting a baseball bat, I never thought I'd need to know how to use one of these for anything other than coaching Little League. The first real test came as the eastern windows began to show the pale light of dawn. The infected had found a way to break one of the side entrance doors, and the sound of splintering wood echoed through the gymnasium. Positions, Coach Williams called quietly, and the adults formed a protective semicircle around the children while the older students helped keep the younger ones calm and quiet. The first infected figure stumbled into the gymnasium, a woman in a torn jogging outfit, her morning run interrupted by whatever catastrophe had created this nightmare. She was followed by others, their shambling forms silhouetted against the growing daylight. But something had changed in the group of survivors. They were no longer just frightened people hiding from danger. They had become a team, united by shared purpose and mutual protection. The children's trust had given the adults strength, and the adults' determination had given the children courage. Remember, Sarah whispered to the group, we protect each other, no matter what. As the infected moved closer, the survivors of Maplewood Elementary prepared to make their stand. They had learned that survival wasn't just about hiding or running. Sometimes it meant standing firm, fighting back, and proving that hope and determination could overcome even the darkest circumstances. The morning light streaming through the high windows seemed to give them strength, and for the first time since the crisis began, they felt ready to face whatever came next. The first helicopter appeared just as the infected reached the center of the gymnasium floor. Sarah heard the distant thrum of rotor blades cutting through the morning air, but she couldn't afford to look up. Her attention was focused on keeping the children behind the protective line that Coach Williams had established using gym equipment and determination. The infected moved with that same shambling gait they'd grown accustomed to, but something was different. As the helicopter noise grew louder, many of the creatures stopped their advance, tilting their heads as if confused by the sound from above. Through the high windows, Sarah could see more aircraft in the distance. Military helicopters and what looked like medical evacuation units. Hold the line, Coach Williams called quietly, but his voice carried a note of cautious optimism. The infected seemed less focused on the survivors, many wandering aimlessly as the helicopter sounds multiplied overhead. Principal Johnson, baseball bat still in hand, moved carefully toward one of the high windows. There are vehicles in the parking lot, he reported in amazement. Military vehicles, ambulances, people in hazmat suits. The sound that came next was the most beautiful thing any of them had heard in 6 days. A human voice amplified through a megaphone, speaking clearly and with authority. This is Captain Martinez with the National Guard. The area has been secured. If there are survivors in the building, please signal your location. Sarah's heart leaped at the coincidence of the name, Martinez, like her own, and she quickly grabbed one of the gym's emergency flares from Coach Williams' supply cache. The bright red flare shot up toward the ceiling, its brilliant light visible through the skylights. Signal received. Rescue team en route to your location. Stay calm and stay together. The infected in the gymnasium seemed increasingly disoriented as more sounds came from outside. Vehicle engines, radio chatter, the organized movement of a professional rescue operation. Whatever had drawn them to hunt the living seemed to be diminishing, as if the crisis that had created them was finally being brought under control. Mr. Kim's voice suddenly crackled through the school's intercom system, startling everyone. This is Kim in the basement. The cavalry has arrived. Repeat, we have rescue personnel in the building. Cheers erupted from the children before the adults could stop them, but it didn't matter anymore. The sound that had been so dangerous for 6 days was now a celebration of survival and hope. When the gymnasium doors opened, it wasn't infected figures that entered, but soldiers in protective gear, followed by medical personnel and emergency responders. The lead soldier removed his helmet, revealing a kind face that reminded Sarah of her own father. I'm Sergeant Rodriguez, he said, his voice warm despite the circumstances. We're here to get you home. The evacuation was swift and professional. The children were checked by medical personnel, wrapped in blankets, and reunited with the other survivors from Mr. Kim's group, who had been safely extracted from the basement. As Sarah watched the children being loaded into evacuation vehicles, she felt a profound mix of exhaustion and relief. Mrs. Patterson, still carrying her bus driver's radio, was already coordinating with transportation officials to reunite the children with their families. Many parents were waiting at the emergency shelter that had been established at the high school, having survived the crisis in their own ways. Miss Martinez, called Marcus, the boy who had asked about his parents. He was wrapped in a Red Cross blanket but managed to break away from the medical team to run back to her. My mom and dad, they're okay. They're waiting for me. Sarah knelt down to hug him, feeling tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed for 6 days finally coming. I'm so happy, Marcus. You were so brave. Coach Williams, his arm finally receiving proper medical attention, joined the group of educators watching their students reunite with families. You know, he said to Sarah, I've been in combat situations before, but nothing prepared me for the responsibility of protecting those kids. You all did something extraordinary, Captain Martinez told them as the last of the children were safely evacuated. The after-action reports indicate this was one of the most successful civilian survival operations we've documented. Your quick thinking and teamwork saved lives. Principal Johnson, looking older but somehow stronger than he had 6 days ago, surveyed the empty gymnasium. It's strange, he said. This place was our prison, but it was also our sanctuary. We learned what we were capable of when it mattered most. As the sun climbed higher in the clear autumn sky, Sarah took one last look at the playground equipment outside. Soon, it would be filled with children's laughter again. The swings would move with the joy of play rather than the empty breeze of abandonment. The nightmare was over, but the bonds forged in those dark days would last forever. They had faced the unthinkable and emerged not just as survivors, but as a community that had proven love and determination could overcome any darkness.